I think for me, when I think of this novel, I actually think of the Vietnam documentary that Ken Burns and Lynn Novak made a few years ago, because there was, one thing I liked about this documentary is they actually talked to a lot of Vietnamese people on all sides. And there was this woman they spoke to who had been a Vietnamese soldier, a North Vietnamese soldier. And before she went to serve, her parents gave her a copy of A Farewell to Arms. And she brought that with her. She was building the road through Cambodia that the North Vietnamese were using to get around the demilitarized zone and get supplies to the communists in South Vietnam. And every night, the road that she was building would get bombed by the Americans. And as she was sheltering from the American bombardment, she was reading A Farewell to Arms. And she felt like it made her feel connected to all the soldiers throughout history who had suffered in war. And I found that very powerful, especially because Hemingway, I think, attracts a lot of criticism for being a white male writer. So I found it very powerful that she was so moved by this work of literature because she connected to it as a soldier.
Absolutely. And you hear it like, I think you're talking like the kind of the universality of literature. The thing that we're always talking about is how it transcends all these other things, like this human basic stuff where it is deep, it is meaningful, it can choke you up, it can be so powerful. And obviously Hemingway is known for being able to create that through his literature, like making us feel this. And yeah, I'd actually forgotten about that scene in that documentary. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's in it's just a great example of how powerful these books can be, these poetry can be, like these things that are just a book sitting on a shelf, but then when you open it up, even if there's like bombardment over your head of like military bombs going off, it can bring you something, some, even if it's not comfort, well then some type of, I don't know, I guess I don't want to say contentment because you're not content when you're in a situation like that, but yeah, that's fantastic, that's beautiful.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No!
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
Is this your first kid?
Yeah.
Oh, nice. Do you know the gender yet, or?
It's a girl.
Oh, congrats. Names and all that?
Yep.
Oh, fantastic. That's a lot of fun. I guess it's a lot of fun until you're lugging it around miserable and tired for a couple more months.
Well, I don't know. Pregnancy's been pretty hard.
Really?
I was pretty naive about how hard pregnancy was.
The rite of passage, like that's awesome. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, as you can hear, listeners, this is another episode of Heavy Board, and today I'm joined by a guest, Valerie Lute. Valerie is here to talk to us about Ernest Hemingway's probably most famous novel, A Farewell to Arms. And Valerie reached out to me, and I asked her if she would be willing to come on here and have a little book chat. And we kind of got... What, did we meet on Twitter or YouTube?
Yeah, I think I first saw a clip of this show on Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's how I found out about it.
And we started chatting a little bit. You sent me a very nice email, and hopefully we can get a good discussion in here. I mean, I know we will, not hopefully, you know. But
Mhm.
yeah, it's great to meet you, Valerie. Thanks again for doing this. I just want to start with, what's your history with this novel and Hemingway in general? You just give an overview, whatever you.
So I think for me, when I think of this novel, I actually think of the Vietnam documentary that Ken Burns and Lynn Novak made a few years ago, because there was, one thing I liked about this documentary is they actually talked to a lot of Vietnamese people on all sides. And there was this woman they spoke to who had been a Vietnamese soldier, a North Vietnamese soldier. And before she went to serve, her parents gave her a copy of A Farewell to Arms. And she brought that with her. She was building the road through Cambodia that the North Vietnamese were using to get around the demilitarized zone and get supplies to the communists in South Vietnam. And every night, the road that she was building would get bombed by the Americans. And as she was sheltering from the American bombardment, she was reading A Farewell to Arms. And she felt like it made her feel connected to all the soldiers throughout history who had suffered in war. And I found that very powerful, especially because Hemingway, I think, attracts a lot of criticism for being a white male writer. So I found it very powerful that she was so moved by this work of literature because she connected to it as a soldier.
Absolutely. And you hear it like, I think you're talking like the kind of the universality of literature. The thing that we're always talking about is how it transcends all these other things, like this human basic stuff where it is deep, it is meaningful, it can choke you up, it can be so powerful. And obviously Hemingway is known for being able to create that through his literature, like making us feel this. And yeah, I'd actually forgotten about that scene in that documentary. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's in it's just a great example of how powerful these books can be, these poetry can be, like these things that are just a book sitting on a shelf, but then when you open it up, even if there's like bombardment over your head of like military bombs going off, it can bring you something, some, even if it's not comfort, well then some type of, I don't know, I guess I don't want to say contentment because you're not content when you're in a situation like that, but yeah, that's fantastic. That's beautiful. For me, I had the only experience I've had with Hemingway was what they teach you in school and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And listeners that don't know, Valerie has you have your MFA, right? You went through grad school, and then did you major in English in undergrad or literature? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Creative writing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, awesome. Yeah. So you've been a creative writing enthusiast and dabbling in the dark arts of creative writing here for a while.
Yeah, I think I took my writing pretty seriously from a young age. However, I was originally majoring in something else, and I changed my major and wasn't really planning on getting an MFA, but it was when the economy was really bad, so I would recommend that. But
like 2008-ish, 9-ish.
It was 2011. The job market was still pretty sluggish.
Yeah. And then this too, like, and I want to get to criticisms of Hemingway, like you mentioned. It's just because there is kind of, and I think the reason we connected, Valerie, too, was that there is something right now. I call it kind of an atmosphere or a cloud around everything, because everyone always wants you to point to like a specific person or a specific institution or a specific thing to be like, well, it's not real unless you can point to something like that. But I'm like, it's broader than that. It's like an atmosphere of basically just defacing or defaming the canon in some way. Just these great works of art being dismissed because of usually political pet projects that are trendy right now. And Valerie and I kind of found each other through me doing this podcast, and just, yeah, because when I was looking through podcasts and stuff like that, like just literature podcasts, book podcasts, I was trained in poetry mostly. So, I was always doing poetry, and there's just nothing that was talking about this. And I'm like, this is like the biggest thing happening right now. And everybody's pretending that it's not happening, that there's this crazy, or that it's good, that it's like, that we're like destroying Hemingway's legacy and like everything he gave to the world. Like even that great scene that Valerie brought up, yeah, in that Burns documentary. If you haven't watched that, listeners, go watch it. I think it's free. It should be on a few different streamers. It's PBS, right? It should be free.
I think their archive is not free. Yeah.
Oh, okay, right, yeah. Right. Well, I always like to start this with just, how did it read for you? Initial thoughts, reflect. This isn't the first time you've read it, right?
Yeah, it was the second time I've read it. I think that the first time I read it, I was surprised how little the war was in it, but then reading it again, because I had felt that the first time, this time I was like, oh, actually there is a lot of war in it. So it just kind of depends on what you go into it looking for, I guess. I thought there's a lot of just really powerful passages.
I was thinking that too when I was like reading through, and this is the first time I've actually read the whole thing. And so like I was coming to it only from reputation. Like this book has a huge reputation. It's been immortalized in the canon and Western literature, and this is something most people get assigned in high school, although Valerie and I will get into this later in the episode, listeners, that not so much anymore. But it used to be required reading for most people going through like a basic schooling. And yeah, like just like Valerie said, there is so much to take from it, and it's kind of deceiving on first read because it is so simple with Hemingway's prose, very simple, very matter of fact. And yeah, it's written as a war book. And I have a question about this. Maybe I'll just move to this question now. Like, what would you call this? Would you call this a war book, like a love story? What's the kind of the heart of this novel? Because it is kind of both. Like, there's the war, there's the love story, there's the tragedy, like there's Shakespearean level tragedy at the end. And I mean, I'm not thinking we're going to have a definitive answer or anything, but yeah, your thoughts. What would you say?
So it's divided into 5 books, and I think of the 5 books, I think only 2 really feature the war.
Yes.
So that's an interesting way to think about it. Like the first and the third is when he's in the retreat.
Yeah.
I mean, by number of pages it might be different because they're not all the third book, I think, is definitely the longest, but
yeah,
and it definitely, like, in the last 2 are all focused on the love story.
He kind of blends it, like it's this
one
weird.
Thing that
No, go on. Sorry, yeah. No, you're right.
One thing that I found surprising, I think, especially on this second read, is how much humor is in the book. Because I think there's definitely a stereotype about Hemingway, about him being some kind of, like, uptight, stodgy, or, like, very serious, ultra-masculine kind of guy. Like, in The Midnight in Paris, the Hemingway character is just, like, totally, like, blank face and serious. But there's a lot of very funny scenes in this book, and I think they really serve to undermine some of the tragic aspects also. If you give me a second, there's a...
Yeah, please. Yeah, take your time.
Passages. In chapter 25, that's the chapter where the character of Rinaldi, who's Hemingway's best friend who's Frederick Henry's best friend in the war, he has a breakdown at the end of the chapter, and some people are like, oh, maybe you should go on leave, and he gets really offended that they're even implying that he might be cracking up. But earlier in that chapter is very funny conversation between Frederick Henry and Rinaldi. And Rinaldi is sort of ribbing Frederick Henry about his relationship. And he says, I'll never say a dirty thing about her. And Frederick Henry says, don't strain yourself. There's a passage.
And the priest is there too, right? Like the
Yeah, the priest is the one who suggests, oh, maybe you should go on leave. You're not, you're cracking up. Oh yeah, and another passage. Is it all right if I read a passage?
Please. Yeah, please. We love it on this podcast. I think
this is, for me, one of the most powerful passages of the book. And it ends with this line of black humor, which I think just kind of makes the whole thing that much more powerful. So this is towards the end of the book when he and his lover Catherine have made it to Switzerland for her to give birth to the baby. He says, often a man wishes to be alone and a girl wishes to be alone too. And if they love each other, they are jealous of each other in that. But I can truly say we never felt that. We could feel alone when we were together, alone against the others. It has only happened to me once like that. I have been alone when I was with many girls, and that this is the way you can be most lonely. But we were never lonely and never afraid when we were together. I know that the night is not the same as the day, that all things are different, that the things of the night cannot be explained in the day because they do not then exist. And the night can be a dreadful time for lonely people once their loneliness has started. But with Catherine, there was almost no difference in the night except that it was an even better time. If people bring so much courage to this world, the world has to kill them to break them. So of course it kills them. The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places. But those that will not break, it kills. It kills the very good, and the very gentle, and the very brave impartially. If you are none of these, you can be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry.
My God. Hemingway.
Yeah.
Oof. And I remember reading that section too, and that's like it hits you because like you're reading like the first couple books and there isn't so much tragic stuff till he gets kind of injured and all that, and then you get those last couple books in this and that tragedy starts to strike like so deep that, and the war is like a backdrop almost. You said the war isn't even the main thing, it's just that backdrop of that tragedy, and then the romantic relationship, and then the kind of, and that's kind of towards the end too, right? Where they kind of, they've been through the hell of it, and then there's still more hell to get through even, and it's almost like an acceptance. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that is fantastic, fantastic at the very least. Yeah, that's so powerful. And I think that's like kind of the beauty of Hemingway too, is that he's able to make you feel these in the most simplest way. And I know this used to be what he was praised for all the time. Now people shit on him for it and kind of, oh, it's too simple, it's too stripped back, it's not enough up front, it's too understated. This is more contemporary criticisms that you'll see of it. But then Valerie reads a passage like that, listeners, and you see just, how could you ever say anything bad about a passage like that? And it's dark. It's dark. Would you say there's a little bit of hopefulness in it, even though it's so bleak? Or if you're hearing this, it's because you are listening to the free public feed of Heavy Board. To get complete, uncensored, uninterrupted, full access to this podcast, become a subscriber at patreon.com/heavyboard. That's right. Heavy Board is made possible by subscribers like you. For less than 1 cup of coffee per month, you will receive private access to uncensored, full-length episodes, Jerk Shop, heavy bonus content, subscribers-only AMA episodes, bonus extended interviews, and more. Come join the conversation today at patreon.com/heavyboard.
I wouldn't say so, because this is sort of like, I think the reader doesn't know yet that Catherine is gonna die shortly. And he's basically saying, looking back, this was the only time he ever obtained this perfect love where he never felt alone anymore. And it's also foreshadowing her death, because she was so great, she had to die quickly.
Yeah. And I want to touch on the foreshadowing too. That there's a couple of different moments, like even from the very first book, where we're starting to get foreshadowing for this kind of tragic ending. I was thinking, like, chapter 7 in my version. I have, listeners, the Hemingway Library Edition, which is like a very famous one that you'll find all over Amazon and stuff. I guess we didn't even talk about that yet. But what version did you read, Valerie, for the book nerds out there?
I have a Scribner paperback.
Okay, nice. And sorry, listeners, I skipped over this part right at the beginning there. We were getting too excited to get right into it. Originally published in 1929 by Scribners and Sons, and this version that we have, that I read, has basically, it's like the kind of, I don't want to say it's like a Norton critical edition, but it's kind of just for like literature lovers, where they have, Hemingway's alternative endings and early drafts and a lot of the stuff from the archives. So it's a good edition to have on your shelf if you're looking to pick it up. Obviously, we will link it in the description below. And this edition was first put out in 1957. So, like 20 years after the original publication, but it was already a huge hit and success by that point, and went down in history, made Hemingway's name essentially. Sorry, I didn't mean to get distracted on that. But the foreshadowing, yes. So I was thinking, like, the foreshadowing, like, where we have right on this, on page 31 in this chapter 7, where we have the first kind of thing where he's talking to us, he's telling us, and he kind of foreshadows that he's not going to die in this war, right? We get kind of the character's confidence from Frederick, and just kind of the strange reasoning for it, too. But just this kind of, it's a very long paragraph, but just this one section of it where he's talking about, yes, even in the ambulance business, British ambulance drivers were killed sometimes. Well, I knew I would not be killed. Not in this war. I did not have anything to do with me. It did not have anything to do with me. It seemed no more dangerous to me myself than war in the movies. And it was kind of this interesting, because it does take on a different attitude towards the end, but it does foreshadow the fact, I'm not going to die in this war, but everybody else he cares about does. And I mean, obviously that's a literary device. We expect to see that in a lot of things, but just even that with, like, same chapter in chapter 7 there, where we start to get introduced to Catherine, and we first see, like, his reluctant love for her. It's kind of, I don't want to say it's cold, but it is kind of realistic when he's meeting this girl. She's a war nurse, he's an ambulance driver in the war. And usually, historically, everybody knows those probably won't work out. Who knows? But, like, he starts to fall for her, and he won't admit it to himself for a while. But, he does notice in that chapter 7 there, I marked it, page 35, where he starts to feel empty when he's not around her. The very last paragraph of chapter 7, I went out the door, and suddenly I felt lonely and empty. I had treated seeing Catherine very lightly. I had gotten somewhat drunk and had nearly forgotten to come, but when I could not see her there, I was feeling lonely and hollow. And it's very like the end of the chapter. It's like the first very subtle hint that he's falling in love with this woman. And then I think it's like chapter 14 or something where he actually admits that he loves her. Because even before then, he's saying that he's like lying when he's like, "Oh, I love you too. I lied." Or, yeah. Because it's like, it seems cold, but I think it's also realistic. Where like you don't know how these relationships start, and I think like with my wife and stuff, it's always unexpected, right? Like you meet somebody, you're talking, blah blah, and then all of a sudden there's this moment where it's just, oh wow, like without you, life feels so empty, so lonely, and I didn't even realize it until after several years or whatever it is, several months, just I don't know. I mean, I guess I guess it's a realism of some type, or I don't know.
Yeah, I had a question about your interpretation of the plot itself. When do you think they first had sex?
Ooh, okay, yeah, that's interesting. I guess the hospital.
That's what I thought, but I watched both the movie versions and they put it way earlier.
Yeah.
I watched the 1932 movie. I wouldn't recommend it. I thought it was kind of cheesy, but it was pre-code,
Right.
pre-Hays Code, so they had less censorship, and it was a very racy movie in terms of just the dialogue. They didn't show anything, but
Right.
in I think the first scene of that movie, a nurse is being dismissed for getting pregnant, so they're trying to foreshadow that, and then she and Catherine and Frederick Henry sleep together on their first meeting, and then she's laying in the dormitory with the other nurses at night, and they're like, "How could you do that? You hardly knew him. It's not like you two were in love." And I think both the movies were taking that from the play, which not familiar with, but
Me neither. Yeah.
but in the novel, he does say when she's giving birth that this was the product of good times in Milan, which implies that they first slept together in the hospital.
Right. And it is, I guess, because this was published like 1929. Like, yeah, like you couldn't put like not even pornographic, but just like any type of description of sex or lovemaking or anything like that. Like now, that's changed in, post 1950s. There was all kinds of raunchy stuff in novels, but before that, you really couldn't. They wouldn't let you in the publisher.
Well, one interesting historical fact about this novel, it was originally published in Scribner's magazine, and it was quite controversial. It was actually banned from newsstands in Boston because it was pornographic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. I didn't look into any of that, but thank you for that is, because that is, wow, this was banned from newsstands.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see that in the banned book posts all over the place. Yeah.
Banned in Boston.
Yeah. That's, it seems so like banned from being sold at newsstands too. I guess it does seem like another world when no newsstands don't even exist anymore. Yeah. God. And I guess we've talked about this sometimes on the podcast where there's the books that do get this kind of reputation or banned for whatever reason by either the federal government or a local government or whatever it is, where they, actually banned too, these people pretending that books are banned nowadays in the 21st century in the West. Well, not really, but sure. And it's just, that adds something to it. It adds a curiosity. It makes people want to read it even more when they know that, oh, there's something in it that they don't want me to see. And we don't talk about it as much with a book like this, but yeah, you would think, I'm sure it was happening all the time. And you think back to those, just, I love Edith Wharton. I'm going through a kick right now, so I've been reading a lot of her stuff. And she talks about some of the letters she would get for just the stuff she wrote. Like they would be like taking her, like a random fan writing her a letter about, oh, haven't you ever met like a normal person? Like all the women you write are awful, but like taking her to task for not being more pleasant or something in like the fiction. And it just, I don't know. I mean, like the level of that now, it just doesn't seem anywhere close to what, yeah, writers like Hemingway and Wharton and all these modernists were dealing with in terms of these petty little bands, these kind of always restricting. Yeah, sorry, go on.
It was also very controversial for its portrayal of war. People considered it to be anti-war, and many people canceled their subscriptions to Scribner's because they thought it was too pacifist.
Oh, the more things change, the more they stay the same, don't they? I'm not subscribing to your shit anymore because of this. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of
So,
course.
would you consider this an anti-war novel?
Yeah, I think I would. Yeah, I thought about that a lot, and I was thinking about this in terms of I read Vonnegut, I read a few things recently, and I was talking to some other guests, and I was starting to think about, because something like Slaughterhouse-Five, I would say, is an anti-war book, but then it also is very practical about how, war is terrible, but it's also inevitable. And I think there might be a little bit of that in this too, where I think it's definitely anti-war, even just like the conversations between the soldiers, which is a lot of this book. Like and I guess even the ambulance drivers and the people that they were interacting with. And it just, everybody hates it. Everyone's, oh, the war is terrible. Like, oh, it's killing me. Like this war is brutal. Everybody hates it. And yet it keeps going on, right? And yet it keeps happening over and over and over again throughout history. And there is this, I guess at the time, World War One, it's hard to go back. We could only read about it, like Valerie was saying, and it's hard to realize, I guess, how big of a deal World War One and World War Two were. So if you were writing something that was pacifist or anti-war in some way, people would think you were siding with, the Germans or something, and those, and start just like now, right? Like if you say something that's like critiquing anything, you're get accused of being some type of German Nazi or whatever or part of that. So yeah, the more things change, the more they stay the same here.
I think
yeah,
when the U.S. was neutral for much of World War One until the very end, and the U.S. did not see the worst of it coming in so late. And I think Hemingway, because he went to Europe and saw the earlier phases of the war, had a different perspective. And I think what's most, the gritty realism of war, I think, is mainly in the breakdown of military order in the retreat. And I could see how that would be very jarring to people, to see that portrayed, that the military order doesn't remain intact and heroic and valiant while they're in a retreat and they're about to be overrun by the enemy.
Right, and then you're talking about that scene where they're killing the captains, right? They're killing the Italian majors. And
they're killing all the officers because they're going crazy. They believe that any officer might be a German spy.
Yeah, any officer that got separated from the regiment, they were saying, is suspected of German affiliations. And of course, there was no trial. There was no investigation. They were literally asking them questions and then shooting them, in the back of the head, execution style. And that's a very horrific scene. Yeah, and then you see, and I think that is a subtlety that people, don't think about. And I'm glad you made that point, where it is the order doesn't stay intact. And how can it, in a situation where there's all that chaos and violence and mortars going off and shells and people running back? It's all, I guess I don't want to say mutiny because it wasn't quite that, but it does become this free-for-all eventually because it's so disordered. And we still see it play out today, right? Like all the horrific things that happen, the war crimes are usually committed when the order breaks down, when there isn't a commanding officer in charge, or they've mutinied against him, or whatever it is, and all the rules and order break down. It just becomes chaos and savagery and horrific shit. I it is kind of sad, right? Like this is a sad book, and I don't know. When I was reading through it here the first time, I was just like you said, I was laughing at parts. There were beautiful little scenes, especially when he and Catherine are having a good time when he's on leave. I think that's like all of book two, right? It's basically him and Catherine falling in love and being on leave and not having any of the war bother them really. And then you go back into it. You know, I've been reading a lot of World War One books recently too, and it is kind of everyone talks about World War Two, and World War One kind of gets forgotten with how kind of bloody it was and tragic, and the no man's land and stalemates everywhere. No, like almost no territory got reassigned, and I don't want to say it's a lost war because obviously it's a huge deal and a huge thing in history, and we get taught about it, but this emotional side of it, I feel like everybody's focused on the more recent thing, which was the World War II one and all the kind of postmodern writers that came out of the World War II and wrote their World War books. But these modernist writers all writing about World War One, man, was that brutal. Oh man. How was when you were reading this through, like how was that for you? Like some of these like more horrific scenes or even just more broader, like how do you feel about like reading horrific scenes in novels or graphic scenes or
One thing that I became aware of reading this a second time is that I do a lot of my reading on the subway, and I do think that makes it harder to get emotionally involved. You know, it's the time I have to read, but you know, when it's noisy, I was definitely kind of noticing, you know, I think there was a lot that I missed the first time because I read it on the train. And on this read, I was sort of noticing how much if it was a quiet day, how much more emotionally impacted I was by what I was reading than if it was a noisy day on the train.
yeah, that like the distractions. And I think this is like everyone talks about, and I think literacy rates and stuff have stuff to do with this, but like everybody talks about, oh, nobody's reading anymore. And it's like, yeah, they're not reading anymore because they're distracted. Like nobody can even sit down. Like, especially you look at I look at my nieces and nephews. I don't have any kids of my own, but like I have nieces and nephews that are around like school age kids, and they're pretty active readers, although the one is not, you know, and you kind of look around and yeah, they have so much to distract them. And even like Valerie was saying, you can be somebody who's a big reader, gone to school for this, has always been a big reader and writer. And even then, if you're in a noisy place or your phone's sitting by your lap or you're just, yeah, you know, like a public waiting room, like I do a lot of that too. Like when I'm waiting somewhere, I'm like the only freak that, you know, brings a book with me or something. If I know I have to sit in like a medical office or something or whatever it is, and you got to wait DMV, you know, wait for a few hours you weren't planning on. And, yeah, it does change how you interpret the things around you. If you're distracted, you're not getting that full impact. And I mean, I'm not someone that like, of course, I'm not someone that gets super choked up or super, you know, offended or sick to my stomach from reading super graphic stuff. But then there is sometimes when it happens, you know, like sometimes that happens, and that's being able to get somebody to feel that through just words is just, I'm always like, that is the art form that we're all trying to practice here, is like getting people to experience this regardless of everything around them. But it does take effort. I get it. Yeah. Like, so what you were saying, it does take concentration, a lot of effort, I guess. Yeah. For any lack of a better term there.
I was thinking, for me, when he escapes from being executed, and even some of the scenes before that when they're on the run in the retreat, I found it a bit over the top and unrealistic. I kind of feel like Hemingway, in some ways, is appealing to this male heroic fantasy, which is like when he like jumps into this freezing cold river, and people are shooting at him, and he floats down the river on a piece of wood. I mean, I just found that kind of incredulous that he wouldn't just get hypothermia. But I think that part of the reason why it has an impact on people is because it is appealing to this subconscious male fantasy.
I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah. Like Valerie said, it's something he gets hit with all the time. Like now, and he's dead, whatever. But it's like he gets hit with that all the time. Is his appeal to this fan? Snows of Kilimanjaro, and a lot of his short stories were, they're very masculine. He's a very masculine writer, and I think you're right. I think there are a few parts where it's really of trying to appeal to that kind of. It's weird for me because I know, I mean, it's hard to say because I was never alive at that time, or even my grandparents, were not alive during World War One. They were born after, but it's like, so I never got to talk to anybody that was there. But I wonder if it is almost like he's not a compensation, but there is this kind of male. I don't want to say fantasy, but like bravado of like they wish they could be this hero in these situations or escape a situation like that. So I think there is that to it. And especially, when he's jumping and riding the river current down a few miles and getting away scot clean. Even them, I guess, escaping from Italy is a little unrealistic, especially with that umbrella, but whatever, like it's a novel, right? So you can forgive certain things, but I think that's apt. That masculine kind of heroic. I mean, it's what he's known for, right? Like,
and it might also say something about the difference in audience. That this was a massively popular book. It was in a popular magazine, and having those scenes is kind of maybe increasing the broader appeal, making it more of an adventure novel.
Yeah. That I think that's true too. Yeah, especially those last two books where there's like the escape and like a kind of an adventure thing, and you don't know if they're going to get out or not, and then they're coming to arrest them both. That morning. Yeah. Definitely. And sure, it's a novel, it's popular. If you're going to write a novel that sells a lot of copies, you got to give the audience, you got to give them a little action, a little romance, a little sex, Yeah. If you're hearing this, it's because you are listening to the free public feed of Heavy Board. To get complete, uncensored, uninterrupted, full access to this podcast, become a subscriber at patreon.com/heavyboard. That's right, Heavy Board is made possible by subscribers like you. For less than 1 cup of coffee per month, you will receive private access to uncensored, full-length episodes, Jerk Shop, heavy bonus content, subscribers-only AMA episodes, bonus extended interviews, and more. Come join the conversation today at patreon.com/heavyboard.
I would say the reason why there's that kind of ridiculous fight scene at the end of Hamlet with the poison sword, because poison swords make sense. I was like, Shakespeare was probably like, oh man, I wrote this play, it's almost 4 hours long, I haven't had a sword fight yet.
Right.
I gotta find a place to put a sword fight before the end of the play to keep the groundlings happy.
Yeah, the audience is going to be throwing tomatoes or whatever if he didn't, by that point they would be like walking out, yelling, shouting, like, where's all the violence? Yeah. Are you a big Hamlet?
Yeah, but like a lot of the canon was very popular when it came out, and that's why I think it often tells us a lot about society of that time and what people are interested in.
I'm so glad you made that point, Valerie. Because yes, I'm agree 100% with that. And I think this is where people like us that have been trained in this and excessive education in the canon and stuff. There was a time, and it was not so long ago, and it lasted for quite a bit, where the best novels also equated to be the most popular in a lot of ways. That was more of a 20th century thing when we started to have this thing called pop fiction. And, it was like purposely not trying to be any literary stuff at all. or it was just, adventure, maybe, because even the pulp stuff, I like the pulp stuff, like in the early part of the 20th century. And even that has a lot of literary aspirations by the writers, even though they're not known as big literary writers. They still took it seriously and they put a lot of work into it. You could tell, it's very clean when you're reading a lot of those guys and a lot of those writers. And I think now we feel like that's not happening anymore, right? Like the most popular movies or books are no longer the best ones that come out each year. Like there's a divide between what's actually the best art and then what makes and sells the most or is the most popular.
I don't know that I would put it that way. I think for a long time the novel was considered less serious than poetry. It's like when we think of like the great 19th century novels, at the time they were sort of considered lesser than the poets that were writing at the same time. And I do think there was sort of this divide. Genre fiction became a term in the 20th century, and I think that now, as sort of fewer people are reading, there's not really going to be an audience for that kind of airport novel anymore.
Right.
Because the people who used to read airport novels now just look at their phones.
Right.
So
yeah.
What we have instead are, I think, these, what they call upmarket, where they try to blend some genre and some literary aspirations. Because at the end of the day, the people who want to be readers still don't have the attention span that people had 100 years ago.
Right.
So they can't really, getting into some of the, I think Hemingway is one of the more accessible modernists, but the other modernists much more difficult.
Right. Yeah.
To get into.
Yeah. That's for sure. I think that's true. I think you're right. Yeah. And it's so hard, I guess one of the things that I always find fascinating and interesting is that like is it perception or is there actually something that happened or is it just perception that we, think that less people are literary minded, because we are looking back, like the whole canon is looking backwards with maybe even rose-colored glasses in a lot of ways, just romanticizing. Oh, wouldn't it be great to, I don't know, like, oh, they were so successful, and then you actually read some of their lives, they weren't that successful. A lot of them were living in poverty besides the really wealthy ones that were born into like estate money, and like Hemingway himself, like was full of poverty most of his life, and even after the success of the books. So yeah, I mean, it is difficult. I do try to not let that cloud out my judgment or put too much weight on that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's why I do try to be fair to people that would push back if we say, oh, there's actual hostility towards the canon. And people would say something like that as, well, it was never actually that, popular or something. It wasn't always like the most high-minded stuff, but then it's like, well, that's disingenuous because we're talking about it in the high-minded way, like, and it's actually being pushed back on in this high-minded way, and not that. I wanted to ask you about this scene here, and I think it's one of the more romantic aspects in chapter 23, page 134 in my version. It was when he was talking about is after the hospital, and he and Catherine had a chance to see each other again. But it was when he was talking about, like, kind of, they felt like the hotel room was their home, and they felt like the hospital room was their home. And I'll read the short paragraph here, and then I want to ask you about it, where after we had eaten, we felt fine. And then after, we felt very happy. And in a little time, the room felt like our own home. My room at the hospital had been our own home, and this room was our home too, in the same way. And what I was struck by with this was this kind of, what do we think about this? This kind of making a home in these unusual places. And because it does kind of broaden out that term home, like when you have your partner and all that with you, and then you can make a home anywhere almost. But it's just, what did you think about that?
I think in this novel, neither one of them has a real home because they're both foreigners in this war that has nothing to do with them. I mean, the British were in the war, but not on this front, and the Americans were not in the war at all. So neither one of them really has any connection to this place or what's going on around them, except for the love they have for each other.
Yeah. And I thought about this. It made me think of, personally at least, when I was reading that section. I lived in a few different places, and all the weird places, like the extreme moves that I've done, where I moved to a different climate, different culture, basically. Still in the U.S., but I grew up in Baltimore, and I moved to Louisiana for grad school, and now I live in Vegas out here in the desert, you know. And my wife came with me for both of those moves. And I just remember thinking, like, there was a point, I remember very distinctly, after a few months of being in either of those places, like a new place where you don't know anybody, you need to use fucking GPS just to get to Walmart or something, you know, because you don't know the roads yet. And then after a couple months or so, as long as you have that partner, you know, your spouse or the person you love or whatever it is, your kids, as long as you have that and like kind of a roof, you can make that home. You know, like a home is that kind of, what's the cliche? Home is where you make it, right? Like it really is like, this is our home. This is where we live. This is where everything we love is, like. And I was just really taken by that passage, kind of like making a home literally in the middle of a war where all this chaos around you, and as long as you have this person you love and you're committed and blah, 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 and it just, you can make it feel welcoming and loving, like those homey feelings that everybody craves in life, you know. And I was just struck by it. I was like, man, you know, given all the violence in this novel, all the kind of, you know, tragedy, and then that is still the thing, you know, maybe that's what makes it so tragic towards the end there, which I want to get to with you, but yeah, like this, I don't know. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Or am I just, you know, talking crazy or whatever it is? Yeah. That hit me for some reason. Maybe it's just where I am. Maybe it's just, I don't know. And then, like, reading this too, I got like weird, this for the poetry nerds, or when I was like halfway through this novel, I suddenly got Sabrina Ora Mark Simsam vibes for her poetry collection. That's a deep cut, listeners, but if you haven't read that book and you like poetry, read it. I didn't realize it at first because I had read her poetry book so long ago, and then reading Hemingway now, it's almost like I did it in reverse, where I got to see the inspiration and like the influence come into this poetry collection, that I was like, oh, this is very Hemingway all of a sudden, and I never had that happen. And I want to ask, like, do you say this story is very simple? Would you say it's like an overall kind of simple plot for this story, or like boy meets girl, or, you know?
I think most of the most powerful stories are pretty simple. I mean, it's love and war, I think, two very big human experiences.
Right.
Although I think we are very disconnected from the reality of war in this country because we really haven't experienced it in a long time.
Yeah.
And we have this sort of underclass who participates in the military, and all of us eggheads don't even beat those people, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's apt, and I hadn't thought about that either, where especially you see all the discourse that goes on all the time, and there's always a war going on somewhere in the world, like, and now that we have social media, we can see live streams of it, you know, 24 hours a day, and everybody has a take on it. All the Americans have something to say, you know. We have the most powerful military in the history of the world. We have dominated the world longer than like almost any other like kind of thing, and yet we're so removed. Like, and I think that's why people could say stuff like, "Oh, Hemingway sucks," or, you know, like just flippant things, or Shakespeare sucks, or things like that, because they don't understand that, like. And I mean, I remember stories from my grandparents even, that, and they were not old enough for World War One, but World War Two and stuff, where they lived through that in America here, the rationing, the you know, just the news coming in every day of people dying, like just unbelievable stuff that we've never had to really deal with at that scale since. And so we have entire generations removed, you know, the baby boomers included, which are kind of the oldest generation now. But yeah, that's. Do you think it'll always be that way, or is it just the luxury of having, a nice, affluent society, wealthy, everybody's relatively wealthy here?
I have no idea what's going to happen with the world in the future. I think there's going to be some very big changes in society for all sorts of reasons that we cannot predict. Imagine if you were, somebody in 1815, would you expect what the world was in 1915?
Right.
The World War One and the amount of industrialization they had by then, and the beginning of radio and motion pictures. And
Right.
we really can't predict what's going to happen.
Man, that is. When you think about it on large scale, it is kind of hard to even fathom. Yeah. Taking somebody from 100 years ago and plopping them down, what would they think? Would they be horror? They would be terrified of the technology alone. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the fact that they are, Frederick Henry and Catherine are having a baby in this book. They're having a baby in the midst of all this uncertainty in the war. And so, yeah, I guess that's something that I've certainly been feeling being pregnant, is like, I have no idea where society is heading.
Right.
And all I can do is that I hope that I raise her to be resilient and, can adapt to whatever's coming.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that too. And as I get older, I've been thinking more about, my wife and I are reaching that point where we're like, oh, let's going to try to have children. And when I'm thinking about that more and more, it starts to really plague on your mind. And, if you let it get too out of control, whatever, but I think it is realistic to have concern. And for listeners that don't know, Valerie is kind enough to do this while she is 7 months pregnant, carrying around a future generation here. This brings to the ending where I wanted to ask, because reading it for me, it was tragic. But then I was like, when I got to that point, I was like, oh, wow. Like when you're actually going through it too, like, did the ending really hit harder because you were pregnant or about to have a child of your own? And
Well, I was reading that scene where the doctor is assuring Frederick Henry that there's no risk for a cesarean section, and I said to my husband, I would not have a cesarean in 1918. Today, I would prefer to avoid it, but
right.
I think I'll be fine today.
Yeah.
One thing that I thought was very ridiculous is, maybe you missed this, she says the doctor tells her to drink more beer because it will lower the baby's birth weight, which it will. They weren't wrong.
Fetal alcohol syndrome, prescribed fetal alcohol syndrome from the doctor. Yeah.
She drinks a lot throughout her pregnancy.
Right, and smokes, I'm sure. I remember my grandmother.
I don't remember smoking, but yeah.
My grandmother smoked through, all her pregnancies. I don't know if she was, I'm sure she was drinking too. Yeah, just 40s, 50s. Yeah.
They did know it was bad. It's actually.
Yeah,
they did know. Maybe Hemingway didn't know. Maybe it wasn't. Everybody didn't know. Generally, I think, at least there was a time period when women were told to avoid hard liquor, but not beer and wine. Although I think she's drinking both in this novel. So.
Yeah. And there wasn't that. It is weird because we know now, and then culturally that's a big taboo, right? So if there's scenes in movies now where people show whenever somebody sees a pregnant woman smoking or drinking or something, there's horror, everybody around them's like, oh my God, but then 1918, these people, nobody was thinking that at all. So you could just go into a bar like pregnant and nobody would bat an eye. Like nobody would be like, you sure you want to be here? Like, yeah. And I thought too,
I
I
mean,
was
the
like,
doctors even know that it's gonna cause a little birth weight. They just think that's a good thing.
right.
Saying like, well, you have narrow hips, so it's better if you drink to keep the baby small.
Oof, God, yeah. And I was thinking that too, like it was such a tragic, I guess having complications in childbirth at that time was much more common than it is now too. I mean, this is
I would
before,
say it's just as common. We just have better medical care. I mean,
right?
it's human birth is pretty risky. I've been thinking about that a lot and thinking, just like human anatomy creates these risks because of our unique evolutionary history, that a lot of other animals don't have as many risks as we do with pregnancy and childbirth.
That's very interesting.
So we're very lucky that we have modern medical attention.
Yeah, I'd never considered that either. That's incredibly interesting. Yeah, we have small. We only give one at a time, unless you have twins or whatever. So other mammals can do more than one at a time. And then you said, yeah, we have more complications, more things that can go wrong. Maybe because we're more sophisticated, technically, or just higher evolved, and there's
Well,
more parts.
it's because of our large brains. It's a big part of it, and it's also because we're bipedal. We're the only truly bipedal mammal. Like other apes, they kind of walk on their knuckles. So
Right.
they have hands, but they use them for walking as well. So that certainly causes a lot of problems with like back pain and abdominal injuries during pregnancy, and the because the brain is so big, it has a hard time fitting through the pelvis. And human infants probably would be in the womb longer because they come out pretty relatively undeveloped.
Right.
A horse can run within an hour of being birthed. A human, it takes 18 months for them to walk.
Right. Right.
So, I think it really emphasizes how humans really need communities in order to have children. Like,
Right.
you couldn't raise this helpless creature for so long without support.
Yeah. Yeah. That too. And I mean, not to get so much into the kind of large cultural things, but yeah, the there is this sense of community doesn't matter or family doesn't matter right now, and it's nothing. There's probably no better way to rid yourself of those beliefs than to be expecting a child. Like to be like expecting a kid into this world and be like, I need help. Like I need help from my my parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, aunts and uncles, friends. That we need. Like I need help. Like yeah, and maybe that affected too. And maybe that we'll transition to something. We'll transition to this here in a minute with the more MFA writing style, and we get into cultural stuff. But yeah, that is. I don't know, because I mean, I used to think it too. Like I would be, oh, it doesn't matter. Oh, that's an old belief. It takes a village. And even not just child rearing, but just community in general. Like-minded people, like-minded, rituals, studies, whatever it is. Like. It's just so important. Like you can't even function. Like you said, the order of war, like the order of just life, society. Like if you don't have these kind of bonds, even if they're just through, patriotism's become a bad word in a lot of ways too, where like, yeah, just a country, a shared vision of principles and goals and things that we aspire to, and everybody kind of participating in that. Like it does so much. Like it does so much to help us get through tough times, good times, but yeah, it's incredibly interesting that you brought that up. Yeah, very interesting. I think we'll transition here into the next part of it. Any final thoughts on we'll take a break if you need to too in between this here. I know we've been chatting for like an hour.
Let me check my notes.
Yeah. Any final thoughts on this bad boy? On Hemingway, at the writer himself, the figure, the novel itself. Anything we didn't mention? Yeah, go for it. Like I said, anything's fair game. Whatever you want to bring up, if it made you think of some random thing, go for it.
Yeah, I was looking a little bit into Hemingway's life as well,
Awesome. Yeah.
and one thing you can look at sort of his production as a writer by decade. He wrote 6 books in the 1920s,
Whew.
5 in the 1930s, one in the 1940s. Plus, he covered World War II for a year, so that's pretty involved.
Right.
2 books in the 1950s, the last one being 1952. He died in 1961. So sort of as he had this very productive period in the 20s and 30s, and then he really hit a block, and his health was in decline. I think he was in 2 airplane accidents within like a week of each other.
Very Hemingway, yeah.
And then his alcoholism got worse because he was drinking to compensate for as a self-medicating for the
Right.
pain. And he was having mental health problems, and they didn't really have good mental health care. They gave him, random pills that probably affected him in different ways.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's always interesting too. Yeah, you see the production, and it's a good metric, I think, to see where he was mentally, health wise, and that affects the artistic output. And I always say, I mean, Valerie's a writer, like she knows, listeners, that there's this, when you're trying to do something creative, it is a lot of work. It takes a lot of work, a lot of effort. It takes something out of you. And there's like almost recovery when you finish. Like, I'm not going to compare it to sports or something where, yeah, you're really sore and can barely move, but there's a mental toll and even a physical to some extent where you're just kind of trying to recover from putting all that work in. And I mean, I see it rarely talked about, but it is a lot of work to do anything creative and finish it, but then to do something on the level of a farewell to arms, you know, like he says famously, he rewrote the ending to this book 29 times or something, like just over and over again till it felt right. And when you read that ending, you're like, yeah, it had to be. Like it had to be to get it to that tragedy, that all is lost, like this kind of hopeless. Yeah, I mean, how do you make that without being corny? I mean, well, you rewrite it 29 times. People are, oh, well, how long does that take? It takes months to rewrite a chapter 29 times, okay? Like, it takes months of life, of work, of. Yeah.
One of his early novels he wrote in 6 weeks. I don't know if it was this one or The Sun Also Rises.
Oof.
Maybe The Sun Also Rises. But yes, I mean, a lot of times people find it easier to write in a very condensed period of time, but then when you're finished, you're like exhausted.
Right.
You're totally beat. I know Murakami, when he writes, he like gets up at 5 a.m. and writes for several hours, and he every day doesn't like do anything else. But then he must have periods when he takes a break between books, because I don't know how you could do that indefinitely.
Yeah, burnout's real. It's very real, too. Like, you see this with a lot of writers as they reach old age, if they've had long careers, which is very rare to have long careers in a field like this. But yeah, I mean, you see, like, I've read some interesting stuff with him too, where he talks about exercise, like having regular kind of routines, and exercise helps him not burn out from writing those massive amounts of pages every day and thing. That's it's just like training or working out for a sport or anything like that, listeners, you have to train your brain, your hands, your eyes, everything to be able to write for long periods of time. Because most people, you sit down, you're inspired 30, 40 minutes, and then you feel really kind of drained after that. So how do you keep that up for 3 hours at a time, like a Stephen King or somebody? Well, you have to train yourself into it. It's almost like running a marathon, like training for a marathon, where you just have to increase little bit at a time until you're able to do an hour or 3 hour block of intense creative output. It's incredible. I mean, I don't know how anybody can disrespect it. Like it's incredible to be, like, it's so much work.
Yeah, I think that's kind of why being a writer, it's almost like a little thankless in a way. Like, you can be an amateur painter and you can put your painting on the wall and everyone who visits your house can say, oh, that's a nice painting. It doesn't matter that you didn't sell it for $1 million. You can still share it with people. But with writing, unless you are getting a publishing deal, which has more to do with marketability than anything, it's really hard to share your work with people because it asks a lot of people. Reading also takes a lot out of people. Like we were saying, it's hard. We have a lot of distractions. Reading requires more of the audience than any other art form.
Absolutely.
If you're an amateur musician, you can bring out your guitar at parties and you can entertain people and everyone has a nice experience. But if you're an amateur writer, even if you're quite good, just not marketable, it's hard to
Yeah.
share that in a meaningful way.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And then that meme comes to mind, I'm not reading all that, right? Like, I'm happy for you, or sorry that happened though, right? Like, people don't even want to read a long text message. Like, give them a short story. They don't even want to read that, let alone a novel. But like, read this. What do you think? That's true too. I want to get to that when we get, the workshop stuff where like you can barely even get friends to read some of this. You can barely get friends to take the time to read an amateur novel. They're more likely to listen to like an amateur, like, basement studio recording or something, and then physically read it, because it requires something from the reader. Yeah, the audience has to participate and do more work, than a movie or TV show. Or awesome. Yeah. Any final thoughts on Hemingway before we transition? Or
I guess I had one last note about his legacy, I guess.
Yeah.
This is one of my father-in-law's favorite novels, and he said that it inspired him to become pacifist. He was actually very involved in nonviolent resistance during the civil rights movement. And he said, he said that not only does it portray the gritty reality of war, but it also captures the sort of seduction of wanting to become a war hero. And
yeah,
so that was just my final note that I had.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to the power of books like this, where people want to write off books. Oh, it's books, who cares? And I think that's why they try to censor them now too, which we'll get to in this second half here, listeners, because there's some power to them. They can change your perspective in a way. They can change your ideas. They can affect you in a way that makes you reevaluate everything you previously thought, because you saw a new experience, a new way to look at this that you didn't previously. And yeah, that's honestly a beautiful way to end it, Valerie, right there. Yeah. Awesome. You have stuff. Drop your handles for people here in this episode. You have your own blog and stuff that you're working on, right? How do people find that?
Oh, ValerieLute.com.
ValerieLute.com, and your handles, you're at Valerie Lute on?
I think it's Lute Valerie.
Okay. Check it out, listeners. Go there. Lute Valerie at Twitter, and then ValerieLute.com to get the blog, all those goodies up there.
Heavy. Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy, heavy, heavy.
Bored.
I may say the male is entirely hostile. No! Inner.
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. Are you radioactive now?
Inner.
Resources, American resources.
Being bored,
Some activities are intentional, right?
it shows such a lack
Heavy.
of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I
Heavy.
should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy, heavy, heavy.
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.